I thought I had found true love with David, but when I secretly went to meet his parents, I witnessed the worst performance of my life. Two amateur actors desperately trying to pretend they were my fiancé's mom and dad. And what I discovered after that was far more horrifying than I could have ever imagined. Please comment and let me know where you're watching from. My name is Emma Rodriguez, and at 28 years old, I thought I had finally figured out love. Working as a marketing coordinator at a small tech company in Denver, I'd always been the type of person who believed in fairy tales and happy endings. Maybe it was because I grew up with just my mom after my dad left when I was 7, but I'd always craved that picture-perfect family dynamic that seemed to elude me my entire life. When David Thompson walked into my office 18 months ago to pitch his company's software solutions, I felt like Cinderella meeting her Prince Charming. David was everything I thought I wanted in a man. At 30 years old, he was tall, dark-haired, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that made everyone in the room turn to look at him. He wore expensive suits that fit him perfectly, drove a sleek BMW, and always seemed to know exactly the right thing to say. Our first date was at this upscale Italian restaurant downtown, where he ordered wine like he was some kind of sommelier. And I remember thinking that this was what it felt like to be treated like a queen. He was attentive, charming, and seemed genuinely interested in everything I had to say. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was dating someone who was completely out of my league, yet somehow he had chosen me. The first few months of our relationship were absolutely perfect. David would surprise me with thoughtful gifts, take me to concerts and art galleries, and always insisted on paying for everything despite my protests. He had this way of making me feel special, like I was the most important person in his world. The only thing that seemed slightly off was how he never talked about his family. Whenever I brought up the topic of meeting his parents or siblings, he would get this uncomfortable look on his face and quickly change the subject. "My family is complicated," he would say with a dismissive wave of his hand. "They're not really the type of people you'd want to meet." As our relationship progressed and became more serious, I started to notice other little things that didn't quite add up. Whenever we went out to expensive restaurants or he bought me jewelry, he would sometimes seem nervous about money, checking his phone constantly or making comments about needing to budget better. But then he would laugh it off and tell me not to worry about it, that he was just naturally cautious with spending. I believed him because I wanted to believe him, and because everything else about our relationship felt so right. He was the first man who made me feel truly loved and cherished, and I wasn't about to let my overthinking ruin something so beautiful. When David proposed to me 6 months ago, it was like something out of a movie. He took me to the same restaurant where we had our first date, got down on one knee right there in front of everyone, and presented me with a gorgeous diamond ring that must have cost him months of salary. I said yes without hesitation, tears streaming down my face as the entire restaurant erupted in applause. But even in that perfect moment, there was a tiny voice in the back of my head that wondered why none of his family members were there to witness such an important milestone. When I asked him about it later, he told me that his parents were difficult people who wouldn't approve of our relationship and that they probably wouldn't even come to our wedding. The wedding planning process became increasingly stressful as David continued to refuse to let me meet his family. Every time I suggested having an engagement party where both our families could meet, he would shut down the idea immediately. "Trust me, Emma," he would say, pulling me close and kissing my forehead. "My parents are judgmental and old-fashioned. They would just find reasons to criticize you, and I won't let anyone make you feel bad about yourself." While part of me appreciated his protectiveness, another part of me felt hurt and confused. How could I marry someone whose family I had never even met? What kind of wedding would we have with only my side of the family there? The breaking point came 3 weeks ago when I casually mentioned wanting to send his parents a wedding invitation, just to be polite even if they wouldn't come. David's reaction was immediate and intense. His face went pale, and he started stammering about how they didn't deserve to be invited after the way they had treated him over the years. But something about his response felt rehearsed, like he had been preparing for this conversation for months. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering what kind of terrible people his parents must be to warrant such a strong reaction. Or worse, wondering if there was something about David's past that he was hiding from me. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I was going to find his parents myself and try to build a bridge between them and David. Maybe if I could show them how much I loved their son, they would soften their hearts and agree to be part of our wedding day. It seemed like such a romantic gesture at the time, the kind of thing that heroines did in the movies I loved so much. I had no idea that I was about to uncover a web of lies that would shatter everything I thought I knew about the man I was planning to marry. Finding David's parents turned out to be easier than I expected. While he was in the shower one morning, I quickly took a photo of his driver's license with my phone. The address listed was in a suburban neighborhood about 20 minutes from downtown Denver, in an area I had never visited before. I spent the next few days researching the neighborhood online, trying to get a sense of what kind of family David came from. The houses in the area were modest but well-maintained, definitely middle class but nothing fancy. This surprised me because David had always given me the impression that his family was well off, making casual references to private schools and family vacations to Europe that now seemed inconsistent with this address. On a Saturday morning, when David was playing golf with his coworkers, I decided to drive to his parents' house. My heart was pounding as I navigated through the tree-lined streets, rehearsing what I would say when I met them for the first time. I had brought a small bouquet of flowers and a box of expensive chocolates, hoping to make a good first impression. As I pulled up to the address on David's license, I felt a wave of confusion wash over me. The house was a small, single-story ranch home with a modest front yard and an older model sedan in the driveway. Everything about it screamed middle-class suburban family, which was completely different from the wealthy, judgmental parents that David had described to me. I took a deep breath and walked up to the front door, my hands shaking slightly as I rang the doorbell. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened to reveal a woman in her early 50s with graying brown hair and kind eyes. She was wearing a simple sweater and jeans, and she looked at me with genuine surprise and confusion. "Can I help you?" she asked, and I noticed that her voice had a slight tremor to it, like she was nervous about something. Behind her, I could see a man who appeared to be her husband, hovering in the hallway and watching our interaction with what looked like anxiety. "Hi," I said, trying to sound confident and friendly. "I'm Emma Rodriguez, David's fiancé. I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced, but I wanted to introduce myself and maybe talk about the wedding." The woman's eyes widened, and she exchanged a quick, panicked glance with the man behind her. For a moment, neither of them said anything, and I started to wonder if I had made a terrible mistake. Then the woman seemed to compose herself and forced a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, of course. I'm Margaret Thompson, David's mother. Please come in." As I stepped into their living room, I immediately noticed how sparse and impersonal it felt. There were no family photos on the walls or mantelpiece, no personal touches that would indicate a family had lived there for years. The furniture looked like it had been recently purchased from a discount store, and there was an odd smell in the air that reminded me of a hotel room. Margaret gestured for me to sit on the couch, while her husband, who introduced himself as Robert Thompson, remained standing near the doorway like he was ready to bolt at any moment. The whole atmosphere felt charged with tension, and I couldn't understand why David's parents seemed so uncomfortable with my visit. "So," I said, trying to break the ice, "David has told me so much about you both. I'm really excited to finally meet his family." The moment I said this, Margaret's face went completely white, and she knocked over her coffee mug, sending hot liquid spilling across the coffee table. "Oh no," she exclaimed, jumping up to grab napkins. "I'm so clumsy. Robert, can you help me clean this up?" While they frantically mopped up the coffee, I noticed Robert whispering something urgently to Margaret, but I couldn't make out the words. When they finally sat back down, both of them were visibly sweating despite the cool temperature in the room. The conversation that followed was one of the strangest experiences of my life. Every question I asked about David's childhood was met with vague, contradictory answers. When I asked about his favorite subject in school, Margaret said it was mathematics, while Robert immediately chimed in that David had always been more of an English student. When I mentioned how David loved playing basketball, Robert nodded enthusiastically and started talking about all the baseball games he had attended to watch his son play. Margaret shot him a look that could have killed, and he quickly corrected himself, but the damage was done. I was starting to realize that something was very, very wrong with this entire situation. The final straw came when I asked to see some photos of David growing up. Margaret claimed they were all packed away in the attic due to recent renovations, while Robert said they had been damaged in a flood the previous year. Their stories didn't match, and neither of them could maintain eye contact with me when they were speaking. As I sat there listening to them stumble through increasingly implausible explanations, I felt like I was watching a really bad improv performance. These people were lying to me, but I couldn't understand why. What possible reason would David's parents have for pretending not to know basic information about their own son? As I prepared to leave, feeling more confused than ever, I excused myself to use the bathroom. On my way down the hallway, I noticed a piece of paper sticking out from under a stack of mail on a side table. Without really thinking about it, I glanced down and felt my blood run cold. It was a script, and at the top of the page, I could clearly see the words, "Roll, Thompson Parents. Fee, $500 per day." My hands started shaking as the horrible truth began to dawn on me. These weren't David's parents at all. They were actors, and David had hired them to deceive me. I somehow managed to maintain my composure for the rest of the visit, making polite small talk while my mind raced with the implications of what I had discovered. When Margaret walked me to the door, she seemed almost relieved that our meeting was coming to an end. "It was so wonderful to meet you, dear," she said, but her smile still looked forced and uncomfortable. "I hope you'll understand if we seem a bit nervous. We don't get many visitors, and David has told us so much about you that we wanted to make a good impression." Even knowing that she was acting, I could hear genuine guilt in her voice, like she felt bad about the role she was playing in this elaborate deception. As I drove home, I felt like my entire world was crumbling around me. The man I loved, the man I was planning to marry in just 3 months, had hired actors to pretend to be his parents. But why? What was he trying to hide from me? My first instinct was to confront him immediately, to demand an explanation for this bizarre charade. But something held me back. If David was willing to go to such extreme lengths to keep me from meeting his real family, there had to be a deeper story here. I needed to understand the full scope of his deception before I decided how to handle this situation. That night, David came home from his golf game in an unusually good mood, whistling while he cooked dinner and asking me about my day. I watched him carefully, looking for any signs of guilt or nervousness, but he seemed completely relaxed and normal. When I told him I had spent the day running errands and cleaning the apartment, he didn't even question why I seemed distracted and quiet. Either he was an incredibly good actor himself, or he genuinely believed that his secret was safe. The thought that he could lie to my face so effortlessly made me feel physically sick. Over the next few days, I threw myself into researching David's background with the same intensity I usually reserved for marketing campaigns at work. I started with social media, combing through his Facebook and Instagram accounts looking for any mentions of family members or photos from his childhood. What I found was telling in its absence. David's online presence went back only about 5 years, and there wasn't a single photo or post that mentioned parents, siblings, or family gatherings. For someone who was supposed to be 30 years old, his digital footprint was remarkably sparse, like he had deliberately scrubbed away any evidence of his past. Next, I turned to public records and online search engines. I discovered that there were several David Thompsons in the Denver area, but none of them seemed to match my fiancé's profile exactly. The more I dug, the more convinced I became that David Thompson might not even be his real name. This realization hit me like a physical blow. How could I have been in a relationship with someone for 18 months without knowing his real identity? What other lies had he been telling me about his life, his job, his feelings for me? The breakthrough came when I was going through some old papers in our shared home office, looking for any documents that might give me a clue about David's real background. Hidden in the back of a filing cabinet, I found a folder containing tax documents and bank statements from several years ago. The name on the paperwork wasn't David Thompson at all. It was David Martinez, and the address listed was in East Denver, in a predominantly Latino neighborhood that was known for its working-class families and strong community ties. My hands were trembling as I stared at these documents, realizing that everything David had told me about himself was a carefully constructed lie. Armed with this new information, I spent hours online researching the Martinez family at that address. What I found broke my heart in a completely different way than I had expected. David's real parents, Carlos and Rosa Martinez, were still living at the same address. Carlos worked as a construction supervisor for a local building company, while Rosa cleaned offices at night to help support their family. They had been married for over 30 years and were active members of their local church. In several community newsletters I found online, they were mentioned as volunteers who helped organize food drives and youth programs in their neighborhood. These weren't the wealthy, judgmental snobs that David had described to me. They were humble, hard-working people who seemed to dedicate their lives to helping others. The most heartbreaking discovery was a brief interview with Rosa in a local Spanish-language newspaper from 2 years ago. She was quoted talking about her son who had lost his way and cut off contact with his family. "We pray every day that David will remember where he comes from and find his way back to us," she had said. "No matter what he thinks of us now, we will always love him and our door will always be open. Always." Reading those words, I felt tears streaming down my face. David hadn't been protecting me from toxic parents. He had been protecting himself from the shame he felt about his humble background, and in the process, he had broken the hearts of 2 people who clearly loved him unconditionally. I knew I had to meet Carlos and Rosa Martinez in person, but I also knew I had to be careful about how I approached them. The last thing I wanted was to cause them more pain by showing up unannounced and forcing them to relive the hurt their son had caused them. I spent several days crafting a letter in both English and Spanish, explaining who I was and asking if they would be willing to meet with me. I emphasized that I wasn't trying to cause trouble, but that I needed to understand the truth about David before I could decide what to do about our relationship. 2 days after I mailed the letter, my phone rang. The voice on the other end was heavily accented, but warm and kind. "Miss Emma," the woman said, "this is Rosa Martinez. I received your letter, and I would very much like to meet with you. My husband Carlos and we've been hoping for so long to hear something about our David. Would you like to come to our home for dinner this Sunday?" Her invitation was so genuine and welcoming that I almost started crying right there on the phone. These were the people David was ashamed of? They sounded like the most loving, gracious people I had ever encountered. Sunday arrived and I drove to East Denver with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. The neighborhood was nothing like the suburban area where the fake parents lived. Here, the houses were smaller and older, but they were well maintained and filled with character. Many of the front yards had carefully tended gardens, and I could hear children playing in the streets and families talking on their front porches. There was a sense of community here that I had never experienced in the more upscale areas where David and I usually spent our time. It felt authentic and alive in a way that made me understand immediately why someone would be proud to call this place home. The Martinez house was a small 2-bedroom home painted in cheerful yellow with bright blue trim around the windows. The front yard was filled with roses and other flowering plants that Rosa had clearly spent countless hours nurturing. Before I could even knock on the door, it swung open to reveal a woman in her mid-50s with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a neat bun and the most beautiful, welcoming smile I had ever seen. "Emma!" she exclaimed, pulling me into a hug that felt like being embraced by my own grandmother. "We are so happy you came. Please, please come inside and meet Carlos." The interior of the Martinez home was everything that the fake parents' house had not been. Every surface was covered with family photos spanning decades, showing David at various stages of his life, from a chubby-cheeked toddler to a handsome teenager in a graduation cap and gown. The walls were decorated with religious artwork and Mexican folk art that told the story of a family proud of their heritage. The smell of homemade food filled the air, and I could hear traditional Mexican music playing softly from a radio in the kitchen. This was clearly a home where love lived, where memories were cherished, and where family was the most important thing in the world. Carlos Martinez was a tall, sturdy man with weathered hands and kind eyes that immediately reminded me of David. He was wearing clean work clothes and had obviously come straight from a construction site, but he greeted me with the same warmth and dignity that his wife had shown. "Miss Emma," he said, taking off his baseball cap and shaking my hand formally, "Rosa has told me about your letter. We want you to know that any woman our David loves is welcome in our home, no matter what has happened between us and our son." His English was more heavily accented than his wife's, but his sincerity was unmistakable. Over dinner, Carlos and Rosa shared story after story about David's childhood and teenage years. They showed me photo albums filled with pictures of birthday parties, family vacations to visit relatives in Mexico, school plays where David had starring roles, and sports teams where he had been a star player. The David they described was a boy who had been proud of his heritage, who helped his father with construction projects during summer breaks, and who had always talked about using his education to give back to his community someday. "He was such a good boy," Rosa said, her eyes filling with tears, "always helping his neighbors, always respectful to his elders." We don't understand what changed in him. The change, according to Carlos and Rosa, had happened gradually during David's college years. He had earned a scholarship to study business at the University of Colorado, and at first, he had called home every week to share his excitement about his classes and new experiences. But as time went on, his calls became less frequent, and when he did call, he seemed embarrassed by his parents' accented English and their blue-collar lifestyle. "He started correcting our grammar," Carlos said sadly. "He would get angry if we spoke Spanish in front of his college friends. We could see he was ashamed of us, but we didn't know how to help him." The final break had come 5 years ago, when David announced that he was changing his last name and that he didn't want his co-workers to know about his background. He had stopped returning their calls, stopped coming home for holidays, and eventually cut off all contact completely. As I listened to their story, I felt my heart breaking for these wonderful people who had sacrificed so much to give their son opportunities they had never had themselves. They had worked multiple jobs to pay for his education, had been so proud when he became the first person in their family to graduate from college, and had never stopped loving him even after he rejected them. "We know he thinks we're not good enough for his new life," Rosa whispered, wiping away tears with a tissue. "But we just want him to be happy. If keeping us a secret makes him happy, then we accept it. We just pray that someday he'll remember that we love him no matter what." Driving home from dinner with Carlos and Rosa, I felt like a completely different person than I had been just a few hours earlier. The anger I had initially felt toward David was still there, but it was now mixed with a deep sadness for what he had given up in his quest to reinvent himself. How could I marry someone who was capable of such elaborate deception? How could I trust anything David had ever told me about himself, his feelings, or our future together? The plan that eventually formed in my mind was risky, but it felt like the only way to give David a chance to understand the full impact of his choices, while also honoring the love that his parents still felt for him. I was going to arrange for David to come face to face with the two worlds he had created, the fake family he had hired to deceive me and the real family he had abandoned out of shame. If there was any hope of salvaging our relationship, he needed to confront his lies and make a choice about who he really wanted to be. First, I called Margaret Thompson, the actress who had been playing David's mother. When I explained that I knew the truth about their arrangement and asked if she would be willing to help me teach David a lesson, she was surprisingly receptive. "Honey," she said, "I've been doing community theater for 20 years, and I've never felt worse about a role than I did pretending to be that boy's mother. He's clearly got some deep issues he needs to work through, and if you think this will help him, then Robert and I are willing to participate." Next, I reached out to Carlos and Rosa to explain my plan. This was the most difficult conversation of all because I had to tell them that their son had not only cut them out of his life, but had actually hired strangers to pretend to be them when his fiancé wanted to meet his family. Rosa cried when I told her this, not because she was angry, but because she was heartbroken that David felt such shame about them. "If this is what it takes to get our son back," Carlos said quietly, "then we will do whatever you think is best. We just want the chance to tell him that we love him." I decided that the confrontation should happen at a neutral location where David would feel comfortable initially, but where I could control the environment. I chose a quiet restaurant in downtown Denver that had private dining rooms I could reserve for the evening. I told David that I wanted to have a special dinner to introduce him to some friends of my family who were visiting from out of town. He seemed pleased that I was making an effort to include him in my family circle, which made me feel even worse about the deception I was about to orchestrate. On the day of the dinner, I arrived at the restaurant early to make sure everything was set up correctly. Margaret and Robert arrived first, both dressed nicely and looking nervous about their role in the evening's drama. Carlos and Rosa came next, holding hands and wearing their Sunday best clothes. They had brought a small gift for David, a framed photo of him as a child that they hoped he would accept as a peace offering. When David arrived at the restaurant, he looked handsome and confident in the expensive suit I had bought him for his birthday. He greeted Margaret and Robert warmly, thanking them for taking the time to meet with him and asking polite questions about their recent travels. Watching him interact with these hired actors while his real parents sat just a few feet away was almost more than I could bear. The ease with which he lied, the casual way he referenced shared memories that had never actually happened, made me realize just how deep his deception ran. As we sat down to dinner, I caught Rosa wiping away tears as she watched her son laugh and joke with strangers while ignoring her completely. The tension in the room was building to an unbearable level, and I knew that it was time to reveal the truth. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone in the room could hear it. "David," I said, looking directly at him, "there's something I need to tell you about tonight's dinner. These people," I gestured toward Margaret and Robert, "are not my family friends. They're the actors you hired to pretend to be your parents when I went to meet them 3 weeks ago." The color drained from David's face instantly, and he started to stammer some kind of denial, but I held up my hand to stop him. "And these people," I continued, turning toward Carlos and Rosa, "are your real parents. Carlos and Rosa Martinez, the people you've been ashamed of for the past 5 years." The silence that followed was deafening. David looked like he had been physically struck, his mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. Finally, David found his voice, and when he spoke, it was with an anger I had never heard from him before. "Emma, how could you do this to me?" he demanded, his voice rising. "You had no right to interfere in my personal business. These people," he gestured dismissively toward his parents without actually looking at them, "are part of a life I left behind for good reasons. I don't owe them anything, and I certainly don't owe you an explanation for my choices." "David," Carlos said quietly, speaking for the first time since his son had entered the room. His voice was dignified and controlled, but I could hear the pain underneath. "We know you're angry with us. We know you think we held you back somehow. But we never stopped loving you, mijo. We never stopped being proud of you. We just want to understand why you had to cut us out of your life completely." This seemed to break something inside David, and suddenly he was on his feet, his chair clattering backward. "You want to understand?" he shouted, his composure finally cracking. "Look at yourselves. Emma is educated, sophisticated, successful. She comes from a world where people don't have accents, where they don't work with their hands. I've worked my entire adult life to become someone worthy of a woman like her, and I won't let you drag me back down to where I started." The words hung in the air like poison, and I felt something inside me break as I realized that David's rejection of his family was also a rejection of me. "David," I said softly, "do you really think so little of me? Do you really believe I'm so shallow that I would care more about your parents' accents than about their hearts?" Before David could answer, Rosa stood up slowly, her dignity intact despite the tears streaming down her face. She reached into her purse and pulled out the framed photograph they had brought for him. "We brought this for you," she said simply, placing it on the table in front of him. "It was taken the day you scored 3 goals in the championship game. You were so proud that day, so happy to be our son. We kept hoping that boy was still inside you somewhere, but I can see now that he's gone." She turned to Carlos and took his arm. "Vámonos, mi amor. Our son made his choice a long time ago." As Carlos and Rosa walked toward the door, David seemed to deflate like a balloon losing air. Margaret and Robert had already slipped out during the confrontation, leaving David and me alone in the private dining room. He slumped back into his chair and put his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Minutes passed in silence before he finally looked up at me with red, swollen eyes. "Emma," he whispered, "I never meant for any of this to happen. I was just so scared that if you knew the truth about me, you would realize you could do so much better. I love you so much, and I couldn't bear the thought of losing you." "But you lost me anyway," I said gently, taking off my engagement ring and placing it on the table between us. "You lost me the moment you decided I wasn't trustworthy enough to know the real you. You lost me when you chose to build our relationship on lies instead of truth. And most importantly, you lost yourself when you decided that the people who raised you weren't good enough to be part of your new life." 6 months have passed since that terrible night at the restaurant, and I can honestly say that leaving David was the best decision I ever made. It wasn't easy at first. There were nights when I cried myself to sleep, mourning not just the end of our relationship, but the death of the man I thought I had fallen in love with. I had to accept that the David I loved had never really existed. He was a carefully crafted persona designed to win my affection without ever risking the vulnerability that comes with true intimacy. I moved out of our shared apartment the next day, staying with a friend while I looked for a place of my own. David tried to contact me repeatedly in those first few weeks, leaving voicemails where he alternately apologized and tried to justify his actions. But I had learned not to trust anything he said without independent verification. And when I discreetly checked with Rosa Martinez, she told me sadly that they still hadn't heard from their son. Finding my own apartment turned out to be liberating in ways I hadn't expected. For the first time in my adult life, I was creating a living space that reflected only my tastes and values. I chose a small but bright one-bedroom place in a diverse neighborhood where families of all backgrounds lived side by side. Work became my sanctuary during those difficult first months, and when a position opened up at a larger firm across town, I was offered a significant promotion with a substantial salary increase. The most unexpected gift of my new single life was the relationship I developed with Carlos and Rosa Martinez. A month after the restaurant confrontation, Rosa called me to check on how I was doing and to thank me for trying to reunite their family. We started meeting for coffee occasionally, and I found myself looking forward to our conversations more than almost anything else in my week. They treated me like a daughter, sharing stories about their lives and their dreams for David's future. Through them, I learned about the rich culture and traditions that David had been so ashamed of. Rosa became something of a surrogate mother to me, teaching me to cook traditional Mexican dishes and sharing the kind of practical wisdom that comes from decades of hard work and sacrifice. Carlos helped me with repairs around my new apartment and treated me with the same gentle respect he had shown his own daughter. They never asked me to try to reconcile with David, never pressured me to forgive him. They simply accepted me as I was and loved me unconditionally, which was more than their own son had ever been able to do. About 4 months after our breakup, Rosa mentioned that David had finally called them. My heart jumped despite myself, hoping that maybe he had found the courage to face his demons and rebuild his relationship with his family. But the conversation had been brief and unsatisfying. He had apologized for his behavior at the restaurant, but made it clear that he still wasn't ready to have them in his life publicly. "He's still our son, and we'll always love him," Rosa told me sadly, "but he has to decide for himself what kind of man he wants to be." That conversation helped me realize that I had truly moved on from David and the fantasy relationship we had shared. I no longer felt angry about his deception or sad about the future we had planned together. Instead, I felt grateful for the lesson he had taught me about the importance of authenticity and honesty in relationships. I had learned that love built on lies, no matter how well-intentioned, was ultimately hollow and unsustainable. These days, I'm dating someone new. His name is Michael, and he's a high school teacher who lives in the same neighborhood I do. We met at a community barbecue that Carlos and Rosa had invited me to, and what attracted me to him immediately was his complete comfort with himself and his place in the world. He's not wealthy or particularly ambitious in the conventional sense, but he's passionate about his work with teenagers and deeply committed to his community. Michael knows the entire story of my relationship with David, and his reaction was exactly what I should have expected from David all along. He was appalled that anyone would be ashamed of parents like Carlos and Rosa. "Yeah, if someone can't love you for who you really are," he told me on our third date, "then they don't deserve to have you in their life at all." As I write this, I'm preparing for Michael's birthday party, which will be held at Carlos and Rosa's house with their full blessing and enthusiasm. It's exactly the kind of diverse, authentic gathering that David would have been horrified by. And I can't imagine anything that would make me happier. I've learned that real love doesn't require you to hide who you are or where you come from. It celebrates those things as essential parts of what makes you unique and valuable. I still think about David sometimes, wondering if he ever found the courage to reconcile with his parents, or if he's still living his carefully constructed lie. I hope for his sake, and for theirs, that someday he'll realize what he gave up when he chose shame over love. But I've also learned that you can't save people from themselves, no matter how much you care about them. The only person you can change is yourself, and the only love you can control is the love you choose to give and accept. I'm grateful every day that I found the strength to walk away from a relationship built on deception and toward a life built on truth, authenticity, and genuine connection with people who love me exactly as I am.